Is it easy or is it hard to have faith? There's two sorts of faith. There's that initial faith where you first come to know Jesus as your Lord and Savior. And then there's that ongoing faith for the rest of your life following Jesus. I want to talk to you about this question this morning. And it seems to me that if we go back to the start of things, back to the New Testament, and look at the early disciples, that as we read the Gospels, they found it incredibly easy to have faith in Jesus. And why wouldn't they? They were directly confronted by Jesus, the Son of God, in the flesh, God himself standing there before them, and they were challenged, follow me. Now, who wouldn't respond to that? Who wouldn't respond positively to follow me? Who wouldn't leave everything they had and just follow Jesus? Let's look at a few examples. Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 to 22. I'll read it to you. When walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea. For they were fishermen. That's sensible, isn't it? Casting it into the sea because they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Immediately they left their nets, followed him, and going on from there he saw two brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee was their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left their boats and their father and followed him. That sounds really straightforward, doesn't it? Jesus walks up, speaks to these people and says, follow me. And they immediately leave everything behind, including Zebedee and John's father, mending the nets. And they're off for 3 years. Why is it not like that today? Why is it not like that today? Well, we can look back and we say, oh, well, times are different in those days. Life was much simpler. They didn't have as much to lose as we have today. We've got responsibilities, we've got mortgages, and we've got families, and we've got businesses. These men were small businessmen. Try telling the fishermen of Newlyn that they're not important. I think you'll get a stern answer. A physical one, probably, yes. But these small businessmen, whose livelihoods came from the sea, walked away. They were the breadwinners. They had responsibilities. They had families to look after. And yet, when Jesus said, follow me, they just did it. This account of Simon and his brother Andrew and the others is also told in Luke's Gospel in chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. It's not going to come up. But in Luke, we get a little bit more detail, a little bit more background. Luke tells us that it took place at the Lake of Gennesaret. He also gives us a context of that they've been fishing all night and not caught anything, and he tells them to go out, and there's a miraculous catch of fish. Perhaps that helped them a little bit. He also says that Peter recognizes something in Jesus as being holy and says, go away from me because I'm a sinful man. And he tells us that James and John were business partners with Peter. But the core of the story is the same. Jesus comes and says, follow me. And they do. It's that simple. Let's look at another example. Philip and Nathanael. In John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 43 to 59. I'll read it to you. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, follow me. Now Philip from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip said, come and see. Come and see. Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him and said to him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" And Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." And Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel." A little bit more detail there. A bit of prophecy going on, a bit of words of knowledge going on there from Jesus. But essentially, follow me, come and see. Those were the things. And they left everything and followed. And then there's a guy called Matthew. He wrote one of the Gospels, and in Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 to 13, it says how he encountered Jesus. This is what it says. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at a tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, the Pharisees were the religious leaders of the time, the priests or the vicars or things like that equivalent, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I come not to call the righteous, but sinners." Matthew was a well-respected person in the Roman Empire. He was a tax collector. Not so well respected by the people he was collecting taxes from, perhaps. I'm not getting into HMRC now, but like them, people had different views about Matthew and tax collecting. But Jesus says to him, this man who has a respected profession, who has a place in society, who has friends who are tax collectors and other people, "Follow me." And he does. And I could go on. There's many other examples. But it's not like today, is it? It's not so easy today, is it? Jesus gives these men, and women as well, enough to help them believe. It gives them what they need, the evidence they need to help them believe. But we don't have to go much further in the gospel to find someone who didn't find it so easy to follow Jesus. We've already heard about the Pharisees, the religious leaders, who started to question, "Why are you with sinners? Why aren't you with us, the righteous people, the good guys? Why are you sitting with all these sinners?" These leaders, these religious men, found it difficult to receive Jesus because he challenged their understanding of God. They were into sacrifice, and he's talking about mercy. And he claims to be God in the flesh. That in itself was blasphemy if it wasn't true. He turns upside down their rule of life, their religious traditions and systems and all the things that they had built their nice, comfortable lives around. And he shook their very foundations, the society they lived in, the laws they followed, and the ethics they practiced. But I don't want to look at them today. I just want to look at one ordinary man. We hear his story in Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, verses 17 to 22. This is what it says. And as he, Jesus, was setting out on his journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother. And he said to him, Teacher, teacher, all these I have kept from my youth. And Jesus looked at him and loved him. And he said to him, you lack one thing. Go, sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. Disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Wasn't so easy this time, was it? The question, the statement was the same, follow me. But this young man found it very hard to leave behind what he had and follow Jesus. He was a religious person. He'd been to church all his life, if you like, the synagogue. He knew the laws, he knew the prophets. He'd followed all the teachings of the Old Testament. He was a good guy. And it's interesting that when he looked at him, Jesus loved him. But there's one thing that stopped this man in his tracks. And Jesus got right to the heart of the matter of this man's life. What the man thought he was in control of, his possessions, his finances, was the one thing that was in control of him. This passage is not about money. It's not saying that money's wrong or bad, or that it's wrong to have wealth. There are many wealthy disciples in the Bible. Take Priscilla, for example. An example of a businesswoman, a seller of purple cloth. She had a significant household, and yet she was a follower of Jesus. Now, this isn't about money. This is about this guy's identity. His identity was in his possessions, in all that he had, and he wasn't willing to let it go. If you look either side of this passage, there's an interesting context. Just before this young man runs up, Jesus has been welcoming children to him. The disciples have said, stay back. The teacher doesn't want to see the children. And Jesus says, let them come. Let the children come to me. He welcomes the innocents, those who have not got baggage. And just after this passage, Jesus calls his disciples little children for the first time, referencing that innocence with which they have come to follow him. Now I want to be a little bit interactive now, and I want to ask you a question. Because in our lives today, there are some things which stop us or can stop us following Jesus. Maybe there is one thing in your life which you struggled with, or one thing that you're aware of in other people's lives. Let's depersonalize this a little bit. I'm not asking you to confess your deepest sin. Just one thing that has stopped you following Jesus, or someone following Jesus at all, or has caused a struggle in your life. Now, please remember that this is being recorded, so please don't confess to any major crimes. Linda.
My family.
Your family stopped you. Okay? Yeah. Steve.
The Asperger's.
Asperger's, yeah.
I think at one point wanting a relationship.
Wanting a relationship?
Yeah, you know, so before
Stephen,
before
before
I came,
Jesus.
Before. On the tape.
Just clarifying.
The fact
Laurie.
of wanting to be in control.
Wanting to be in control. That's a big one. Sally, sorry.
I think sometimes with the younger ones, the teenagers, I think it's peer pressure, some of it, isn't it?
Yeah, peer pressure.
I think peer pressure doesn't just happen when you're young. I think it carries on throughout your life. And I think just work and being out in the real world, it can be really hard to to follow Jesus, because it does make you stand out.
Yeah. Darby?
Getting saved at a young age but not being spirit-filled led me to a place where I was suicidal because I was trying to apply the things of God effectively in my own strength.
Right. Doing it yourself, basically.
When I lost my daughter.
When you
That's what
loss
tried
of
me.
a child, yes.
When my marriage broke up and I would have done anything to keep it.
Yeah. Marriage breakup.
Sorry, mine was similar. I can't remember to whose. Wanting to make a fool of myself and stand out.
Okay.
No, I didn't want to, but I'm
Yeah.
but I'm becoming
Peer
less
pressure.
worried about that now.
Yeah.
Any type of obsession and kind of OCD, just where you're just obsessed with something or someone,
Yeah.
and it just takes over your life, and it's really hard to think or feel, and just feel pain and suffering.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thank you guys for being really honest and open there, and those very personal things that you've shared. All of those things can sound like very good reasons not to respond to Jesus' call to say, follow me. But they're not. I just want to say that. They're not. Because following Jesus will resolve all those things for you. May not happen immediately, but it will happen. I want to put to you something else. I think that one of the greatest things that stop people following Jesus today is that they've decided the answer to the question in life, is there a God, without even considering it. They've not even thought. They've not looked at the evidence. They've not even, I don't know, they've just decided for some spurious reason, there is no God. I don't need to think about this. Do you want to hear a testimony? I'm not going to tell you my testimony because you've heard that before. But we've got a guest testimony this morning. Now this guy is a serious academic. He's a professor. He's American, so you have to tune into his accent. But he's the leader, or was the leader, of the Human Genome Project, which was one of the biggest scientific projects in the history of science. And if you don't know what that is, you can ask Amanda at lunch afterwards and she'll explain all the details to you. But this guy, Francis Collins, shares his testimony of how he came to faith in Jesus. Paul, thanks.
Well, in the home where I grew up, faith was not something that was talked about very much. My father was a professor of drama, my mother a playwright. When I went to college and those discussions in the dorm late at night about religion began to occur, I had no particular reason to attach value to a faith system. It had never been something I was familiar with or had internalized at all. And I assumed that any religious feelings that anyone held must be on the basis of some emotional experience, and I didn't trust those, or on the basis of some childhood indoctrination, which I felt I was fortunate to have missed. I loved the experience of learning about the human body and all of the components of that, and I particularly loved being introduced to genetics. But then I ended up in the medical school curriculum sitting at the bedside of patients with diseases. This was no longer an abstract study of molecules and organ systems. These were real people. And one afternoon, one of my patients, a wonderful elderly woman, much like a grandmother, who had very bad heart disease. She had a particularly bad episode of chest pain while I was with her. She got through it, and at the end of that, explained to me how her faith was the thing that helped her in that situation. She realized that the doctors around her weren't really giving her that much help, but her faith was. And after she finished her own very personal description of that faith, she turned to me, and I had been silent, and she looked at me quizzically, and she said, "What do you believe, doctor?" And ultimately, I had to admit to myself that her question had made me realize that I had arrived at an answer to the most important issue that we humans ever deal with. Is there a God? And I had arrived there without ever really looking at the evidence. And I was supposed to be a scientist. If there's one thing scientists claim they do, is to arrive at conclusions based upon evidence. And I hadn't taken the trouble to do that. I was greatly assisted by a pastor who lived down the road, who I went and asked about all this, and who gave me a copy of C.S. Lewis's wonderful book, Mere Christianity. Because here was an Oxford scholar, a prodigiously developed intellect, who had traveled the same path. Within those pages, I realized for the first time that one can come to belief on a rational basis, and that in fact, given the many pointers that one sees around oneself in terms of the universe and it having a beginning, and its fine-tuning in terms of the way in which all those constants that determine the behavior of matter and energy seem to have been set just in a certain very precise range to make life possible. And many other things, including my beloved mathematics and why they actually work anyway to describe the universe, something that makes you think the Creator must have been a mathematician. That brought me then to the person of Jesus Christ as a person who was historically extremely well documented. That was news to me. I thought Christ was as much myth as history, and I realized after reading more about it, this was a historical figure upon which we have a great deal of evidence for his existence and his teachings, and even his rising from the dead in a literal way. That day at my patient's bedside started a journey for me, a journey that I was reluctant to begin, but I felt I needed to, a journey that I thought would result in strengthening my atheism, but to my surprise resulted in my conversion.
There's a long tradition of people who are searching for proof that there is no God, who find the opposite. When I was in that position searching for the truth, someone gave me a book by a guy called Frank Morrison. Some of you may remember it if you're my age or above. That begins with a 6, by the way. He wrote a book called Who Moved the Stone? Frank Morrison was a well-known lawyer in London, I think he was based. And he decided that he would write a book to disprove the resurrection of Jesus because he was sure that it didn't take place. And so he gathered all the evidence he could find. And at the conclusion of his book, he concludes it's true. He came trying to disprove it and ended up agreeing with it. And then there's a guy called Lee Strobel, who was an American journalist. He wrote a book called The Case for Christ, which is now a film, after his wife became a Christian and he decided to show her how wrong she was. The story didn't end like he thought it would. He became a pastor of a church called Willow Creek in America. And then there's a guy called Nicky Gumbel. Some of you may know or have heard of him. He wrote the Alpha course from which that video was extracted. And while at university, some of his friends became Christians and he decided to save them. And so he thought, what shall I do? He thought, I'll read the Gospels and then I'll know what to do to save them. And as he read the Gospels, he found that he too was saved, but not in the way he thought. And that was my situation before I became a Christian. I had grown up never considering the question, is there a God? I assumed there wasn't because my family wasn't religious. They didn't go to church. I had no experience of Christianity. And so I just assumed that it wasn't true. Now, I'm not putting myself in the same bracket as these guys, either in intellect or in the impact that I've had during my life. But for each one of us here, ordinary people, we have to ask and answer the same question. When Jesus says, "Follow me," what will we do? And the fact that you're here this morning shows that at least you're willing to consider the question. And the fact that some of you have been here a lot over the years shows that you're willing to consider it at a deeper level. So maybe your next step is something like this. Maybe you start reading the Bible, or continue reading the Bible. Maybe you talk to a Christian friend. Or maybe you want to join an Alpha course. There's one starting here after Christmas, so you're welcome to join if you're exploring Christianity for the first time. That's the first part of the question that I asked at the beginning. Is it easy to have faith for the first time in Jesus? But there's a second part. And I've got to say, it's not always easy following Jesus. Maybe for some of us, the one things that were mentioned on the open mic earlier on are things that we still have obstacles with in our ongoing faith relationship with Jesus. Let's get real. Life is not a bed of roses, is it? I've yet to find the perfect Christian. Have you found the perfect Christian? I've not found one. I want to give you two examples. These examples are extreme, I must admit. And you can put yourself somewhere in between these two examples. Are you Judas of Iscariot? Or are you Mother Teresa? Now, if you don't know who Judas of Iscariot is, he was one of Jesus' disciples. He was in the inner circle. He was one of the 12. But he was the guy who sold out Jesus. He was the guy who took 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus to the religious leaders, who then handed him over to the Romans to be crucified. In other words, he was the one who sent Jesus to his death. Quite a big problem. If you don't know who Mother Teresa was, she was a nun. And she worked in Calcutta for a very, very long time. Her total possessions were a bucket and a prayer shawl, I think. Two things she had. She was a very devout person, and she was a very holy person. Now, I'm not asking yourself to say which one you are, because probably none of us are either of them. But somewhere in between that spectrum, we can probably put ourselves on the line. It may be near one, or it may be nearer the other. I don't want to know. We can easily think that Judas Iscariot's the bad guy, and that Mother Teresa was really, really good. But the truth is that she struggled. She always appeared cheerful and deeply committed to work. But for almost 50 years of her life, right until the end, she experienced what was described as the long, dark night of the soul. Writing in her diary in 1958, she said this: "My smile is a great cloak that hides a multitude of pains. People think that my faith, my hope, and my love are overflowing, and that my intimacy with God and the union with his will fills my heart. If only they knew." Now that's honesty, isn't it? Now I guess if most of us are honest, we probably have those days too. We're probably more like Peter, or James, or John, or Thomas, who wanted to believe but had doubts. Or the other disciples, who wanted to get it all right and to be the best that they could, but just kept blowing it. That's fine. Jesus loves us He calls us. And we're on that journey to Him. To Him. So my final question is this. What about today as we walk out of this building? What are we going to be like? How about following this example? On Christmas Day 1952, the new 26-year-old monarch of the United Kingdom and 14 other Commonwealth nations spoke for the first time to the world in what was to become her annual Christmas address. This is what she said. Pray for me. Pray for me, she asked, that God may give me wisdom and strength to carry out the solemn promises I shall make, and that I may faithfully serve Him and you all the days of my life. That's what the Queen said on her first address. Many years later, in the year 2000, some of you may remember that year. It was a difficult year. She said this about her own faith in her Christmas address. She said, for me, the teachings of Christ and my own personal accountability before God provide a framework in which I try to lead my life. I would suggest not a bad example to follow. A long, faithful example in the ups and downs. As for me and my house, will serve the Lord. If the foundations are firm, the storms don't matter. And we need to understand that properly. It's not making light of the difficulties that we go through. But what it's saying that if our feet are set on the rock, if our foundation is firm, that ultimately, eternally, those storms of life, those vicissitudes of life, if you like, that we go through, will not affect the end. They'll be wiped out. And those words that were written of Joshua so many, many years ago, that him and his household would serve the Lord, that promise is open to us today, whether it's the first time or the 51st time or the 1,001st time. We can promise to serve the Lord. What will we do when we go out of this place today? That's the important thing.